From the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Library of Congress. I'm Peggy Pearlstein, head of the Hebraic section in the African and Middle Eastern Division. Our program today with food writer Joan Nathan is co-sponsored with the Science, Technology, and Business Division and the European Division of the Library. The wonderful display of cookbooks from the library's collections was put together by Connie Carter, head of the Science Reference section. So thank you, Connie. I've known Joan since I began my career at the library 28 years ago. Our working relationship has evolved into a wonderful friendship. And still, Joan never hesitates to ask me the most difficult research questions. The author of 10 cookbooks, Joan has been not only a frequent user of the library, but a frequent speaker as well. She was here most recently when we aired one of the episodes from Jewish Cooking in America, a PBS television series nominated in 2000 for the James Beard Award for Best National Television Food Show. An inductee to the James Beard Foundation's Who's Who in American Food and Beverage, Joan's 1994 book, Jewish Cooking in America, won both the James Beard Award and the IACP Julia Child Cookbook of the Year Award. Her newest book, until today, The New American Cooking, also won the James Beard Award and IACP Awards as the Best American Cookbook published in 2005. Today, Joan will speak about her just-published Quiches, Kugels, and Couscous, my search for Jewish cooking in France. The book will be available for sale and signing afterwards. From Paris to Bayonne, to Alsace-Lorraine, Provence, Côte d'Azur, Burgundy, and Marseille, Joan has traversed France for the past several years in search of Jewish cooking. She's also traversed the centuries as well, tracing the origins of many dishes and ingredients back to the first Jewish contacts with the land many centuries ago. Today, France is home to almost 600,000 Jews, making it the third largest Jewish community after Israel and the United States. In her new book, Joan has uncovered the origins of foie gras, the role of Jews in perfumes and the feather industry, and the use of special spices to enhance a recipe. Before Joan takes us on her culinary journey, please be aware that this event is being videotaped for subsequent broadcast on the library's website and other media. The audience is encouraged to offer comments and raise questions during the formal question and answer period, but please be advised that your voice and image may be recorded and later broadcast as part of this event. By participating in the question and answer period, you are consenting to the library's possible reproduction and transmission of your remarks. And now, Joan.
Thank you, Peggy. If I had known that it was being videotaped, I'm not sure. I would have gone to the hairdresser this morning instead of the dentist. I just got back from Paris from San Francisco at 2 o'clock in the morning. Anyway, this is great to be here. And it's true, Peggy and I have had many conversations through the years about questions for the New York Times or for my cookbooks. And I really couldn't have done this book without the Library of Congress. People said to me, well, how did you go to France to the libraries? And I said, I really don't have to. Between the rare books room here and what you've got in the Library of Congress, sure, there are things I could go to there, but it's right here. I mean, it's an amazing institution. So, Quiche, Kugels, and Couscous, my search for Jewish cooking in France. What I'll do is I'll talk for about half an hour or so, and then you can ask questions, whatever you want. And what I'll do is tell you what I really learned from writing this book, because I started to go to France when I was about 17 years old. My father was German-born, and he felt that a girl should learn a foreign language. So there's Carol. And I went, and I fell in love with French food. I remember somebody this morning asked me a question: what was the most memorable, I hate these questions, the most memorable meal you ever had when you were doing this book? You know, they were all memorable. But this was memorable, the first meal I had, which was in Annecy. Have any of you ever been there? It's a beautiful town on a lake and near Geneva. And I had relatives there that had gone from Germany to France before the war, and they still live there. So I went for lunch, and I just remember first of all, it was so beautiful. And, you know, we started out, there was this hors d'oeuvre varié. There was celery root remoulade, which I love to this day, and carrot râpé, and there was herring and all kinds of beautiful hors d'oeuvres. And I thought it was the meal, and of course I ate a lot. And then the soup came, and the veal came, and the dessert came, and I just was in love with France. And then I remember we went hiking in the Alps, and they had a baguette with chocolate in the middle as a snack. And anyway, but I never thought Jewish. I knew these people were Jewish. I guess I was too young to ask about the war. You know, now everybody asks about the war. Then I didn't ask about the war. Then I spent my junior year abroad, and I also knew a lot of Jewish students that were from a different French background. They were from Alsace, and they were very, very French. And of course, they were very thin, because French women do not get fat. And they, you know, they just ate a little bit, but they ate. They never ate in between meals. Portions were smaller. That I was telling someone this morning that even matzo balls are much smaller in France than our matzo balls. And I still didn't think, I mean, I remember my friend saying to me, you know, my mother's always talking about Israel. I'm so tired of hearing about Israel. I'm French. But, you know, this was in the 60s. So then I went to Israel to work, and I learned about food in Israel. And then I came back to the States, and I wrote my Jewish Holiday Kitchen and Jewish Cooking in America, and I learned a lot about Jewish food in America. I feel as if each of my books is a class, you know, that I have to really immerse myself in whatever the book is to learn something. And then as I got older, I went back to France, and I saw younger people asking about their Judaism. And I guess that's what started me on the quest of writing a book on the food of the Jews of France. And first of all, I had to get my publisher, Alfred Knopf, to consent to it. Judith Jones is my editor, and she said, oh, you know, it's a hard time to get intricate cookbooks out there because of the internet. And she said, well, I don't know if Knopf is going to want to publish it. And then we spoke to Sonny Mehta, and he said, absolutely. And he said, you should call it In Search of the Food of the Jews of France. He understood. He said that Jews don't talk about their food that much. It's a hidden food. So that's what the title was originally. And then as they saw my manuscript, I think, they realized that there was a lot more to this book than what they thought in the beginning. And then they added Quiches, Kugels, and Couscous because they wanted it an alliterative title. And I chose those three for different reasons. I chose them because quiche is a mainstream French dish. It's a quintessential French dish. The Jewish way of doing it has no lardon or no ham in it. And although I spoke at the Alliance Française in Boston, and the person from the Alliance came up to me, he was so proud. He said, look at what our caterer did. They did an onion quiche, and he hadn't tasted them. And I said, well, there's a little ham in those quiches. He said, oh, but I asked for onions, you know. So, and then in another place, I was in Chicago. at a place called the Everest. It's a restaurant, and the chef he's Alsatian, so he did this wonderful Alsatian meal, and the people knew that it wasn't kosher. However, he made this carpe à la juive, which is a very typical Alsatian Jewish dish, where you cook the carp like steaks, and then you have a parsley sauce, or you have a sweet and sour sauce. And in my research, I realized that these are two sauces in Taiwan that were used in the Middle Ages, that were very French and are no longer used except in the Jewish communities of Alsace, because they were used for Friday night or for the Sabbath for their fish, and they were used for holidays. And what I always say about food in general, and Jewish food in particular, because I know more, well, Norwegian food the same. Look at lutefisk. I mean, the food that is used over and over again within a community is the last thing to go within a culture. Nobody was using it for other than maybe fancy dinners in the French culture, so it disappeared. But it didn't disappear. Isn't that interesting in the Jewish community? And so it might be a little bit different. And then I have this other thought, which I'm just, because this is an academic group, I was thinking that, lots of spices were used in French cooking, but not from the 18th century on. And I started to think that maybe because the Jews were spice merchants, which I'll come to later, I'm going all over the place, but anyway, that they were spice merchants, and when they were kicked out, they were going to India and other places for spices. Maybe they weren't that readily available anymore, so people stopped using it. I don't know, but in any event, since the 18th century, French food has been known throughout the world, and it's essentially French, meaning there aren't a lot of spices in it. I mean, you look at in my French cookbook, except for the North African dishes, there are very few spices that are used, because there are herbs used that grow there and fresh, but not a lot of spices. So because you want the flavor of the fish or the potato or whatever it is to shine forth. That's really, to me, the essence of French food. Okay, so that was quiche. Then kugel, because kugel was invented in Alsace in southern Germany, and in about the 10th century, maybe earlier. I always think that when it appears written, it's a long time after it's really used. And what it was there was a Sabbath dish, which in Alsace was a meat stew, a pot au feu. And I think the reason that it was a meat stew was that a lot of Jews were cattle dealers in Alsace. There were a lot of cattle in Alsace, as opposed to the lamb and the goats of southern France. And so they had a pot au feu as the Sabbath dish. And because it was the Sabbath, you'd want a second dish. And this upside down, it looked like a flower pot made out of ceramic. Bread pudding was invented that had leftover bread that was soaked, and it's possible that it was part of the culture in Alsace, because most of the Jewish dishes were part of the culture, and had eggs in it. And then they would put, listen to this, sautéed onion, and then pear. And then serve it with a compote of prunes and pears. It is absolutely delicious. And so that this would be next to the meat. So you'd have a second dish. And of course, Kugels went east eventually, and they changed form. Sometimes you'd use leftover noodles in your Kugel. You'd also use, later, when potatoes came to the old world from the new, you use potatoes in the Kugel. But because it is a German word, you know that it came from Alsace in southern Germany. In addition, Knödel, which is or Knäpfle in Alsatian, which are matzo balls essentially, came again probably from the culture that was in Alsace in southern Germany, and they were adapted to matzo balls. Of course, there were not Manischewitz matzo balls. They were broken up matzah, or broken up bread, and they were a dumpling that was used in the soup or the pot au feu for the Sabbath or special occasions. And they were, again, they're much smaller. And then they went east, and And as Manischewitz only came in about Manischewitz box matzahs in about the 20s or the 30s, because my mother-in-law, who lived in a small town in Poland, remembered the Manischewitz when it came into being, because this was something new. You could make matzah balls from a box rather than broken. You know, people would buy matzah like it would be, let's say you'd spend a kilo and you would get your matzah. You'd order them by the kilo. And of course, a lot of the matzah, because they were fragile, would fall on the side, and that's what you'd make your matzo balls out of. And then the third dish that really, well, anyway, I'm going all over the place. I usually am very much more organized, but okay. So there was the Kugel, and that's because of the Alsatian Jews, which were a big part of the Jews of France. And then, of course, Couscous, because of the North African Jews that compose about 250,000 of the 600,000 Jews in France today. Half of the Jews in France today live in Paris. And France is the third largest Jewish community in the world after Israel and the United States. But what really captivated me in writing this book was that there was a 2,000-year-old history. You know, for an American, 2,000-year-old history. And the first Jews, and they might have come earlier, came to France from Jerusalem, when the destruction of the Second Temple, to Rome. Then they came to France, they came to Catalonia, they came to northern Italy. Catalonia was really, at that time, a separate country, and Provence was part of Catalonia. So that Provençal Jews were really living not in Spain, but in Catalonia. And food, that was what Jewish food was. It was pretty much similar to what they had in ancient Israel, or as the Romans called it, Palestina. So they would have flatbreads, a little bit like soka, which they have made out of chickpea. And I should have put that in my book, which I didn't, because that's really an old bread from Nice. And people used all these flours. They'd either make a gruel or they would make something flat in the winter. And chickpea flour was something that was used through the Middle Ages. They would have olive oil. And by the way, I read Cato on agriculture. If any of you that are interested in food, read it. It is fascinating because you get a sense of what was going on in the Roman world. So that, you know, I knew that they had foie gras. I knew that they fed the foie gras buckwheat. That there were, I mean, they didn't fed the foie gras, they fed the geese buckwheat. That there was olive oil, there was wine. I know that there was wild fennel, because there's wild fennel growing all over the south of France. There would have been maybe some spinach. There would have been garlic, onions, but it was simple food. And that's what Jewish, and then on the Sabbath, the Jews of the south would have probably eaten goat meat or lamb in a stew with maybe fava beans or chickpeas or lentils. That's what people had then, maybe some onions. But that's what they would eat in the south, okay? And that's what was available. That's what grew. That's what also grew in ancient Israel. So then what happened was Jews have always been peddlers and merchants. And people are always saying to me, "Oh, it's so sad. There may be 100 little towns in the south of France where there Jews are no more." Well, there are how many towns in the south of the United States were there peddler towns, where 10 peddlers would meet on the weekend? There'd be a synagogue. There would be a shochet who would do the kosher meat and sometimes teach in the schools. There might be a rabbi, or he might double as a rabbi sometimes. And there would be 10 men, because the women didn't count for anything in a synagogue in those days. And so they would fan out in the countryside, peddling their wares, and then they'd come back for the Sabbath. And they'd come to places like Béziers, Narbonne, Perpignan, Monteux, Carpentras, all over the south of France. And the only remnants that there are little cemetery monuments and maybe indentations where mezuzah might have been. But there are also remnants in the food. If you go to a marketplace in Béziers today, you'll see almond cookies, you'll see orange flower water. You'll see all kinds of things that not just Jews, but Arabs used. It was food that people learned to make. Then there were foods that, and I'll tell you as we're going along, that seem familiar. And I'll give you one example of the Jews of the south of France. In my research, I read somebody by name Colonimus ben Colonimus, who was what they called a Nasi. He was a prince. He was a prince from a princely merchant family from Narbonne. And he went around, he went to, he was in Arles, and he was commenting on the holiday of Shavuot, which is a holiday for cream and butter, and he said that the Jews were distracted in synagogue because they were thinking about the fugas, which is like a focaccia, except that it comes from the word focaccia, but it has like holes in it, so that it's called a ladder bread. And you've probably seen it if you've been to the south of France, or there are a lot of restaurants that make fougasse here. Anyway, and he said, and this ladder bread that they were dreaming about had cream, butter, and it had cherries in it. And then I found a medieval ditty that said that Jews always had oil in their fougasse, so that therefore at Shavuot, at this special holiday, they made it with something else. You know, they made it with cream and butter. And then they said Jews always, in this little ditty, Jews, if there was oil in a fougasse, I mean, if there were lard in it, it was for a goy, but if it was with oil, it was for a Jew. And so that you knew the difference in these breads. And in French, the word is pain pétri, kneaded bread. And that was what you were for the Sabbath. You never went to a store where you could buy a bread. And at these public ovens sold bread, I mean, you'd always bring your bread to a public oven, is what they have in the medieval period, but you could buy during the week. So that a woman would knead her bread, and she'd form it, and then she would go to the public oven with the bread, and then she'd pick it up for the Sabbath. And what was so interesting to me is that I always like to go to a place. First you do research, or else first you go to a place. Then you do research, then you go back to the place. And when I went to Cavaillon, to some of the markets, there were these fougasses, but they didn't have cherries in them because it was a different time of year. They had olives in them, they had rosemaries in them, they had all kinds of fougasses, and I realized this is what it was. This is what so that, you know, what came first, the fougasse for the Jews or the fougasse for the country? My guess is, just as the way it is all over the world, Jews adapted what was there to their own use. It's just like when I was in, well, I'm going all over the place, but when I was at a bat mitzvah in Geneva, we had a regular challah, and I heard all these French people commenting on the brioche. Well, it is the family of a brioche. A challah is. It just doesn't have butter. It uses oil instead of butter. But it is the same family. There's no question about it. So it's you know, it's the way that food has been adapted through the years. Anyway, so there was this food in Provence, and then what was so interesting to me was two things. Charlemagne's grandfather stopped the Arab advance in Poitiers, and in the end of the I think 8th century, and so that it meant that the Jewish merchants took the role of the Arabs in France. There might have been Arabs all over Spain and Jewish merchants, but the Jewish merchants moved all over the world. And we know that there was, through an Arab geographer, there was a Jewish network of traders that went from Baghdad to the Narbonne, to India, to Russia, to China. And they were trading all kinds of things. So they're bringing back furs from Russia. They were bringing back spices from India. They were bringing back, carp. I don't know how they did this, from China, which they put in the rivers in France so that Jews could have their carpe à la juive. I guess that there wasn't they wanted a kosher fish, and it might have not been for them at all, but they brought it back. and I suppose when they were on these trips, these men would go to a confrere's for dinner because he was observed the dietary laws, and he didn't want to go someplace where he couldn't. And who knew how many? There were no, believe me, there were no Michel Richard restaurants in those days in these countries. So he went to India, and what did he eat in India? Eggplant, because India was the home of eggplant, and it hadn't spread yet. So what would you do if you went to somebody's house in another country and you wanted to bring that dish back or that ingredient back? If you saw an eggplant, what would you do? Take the seeds, of course. Or, as somebody said to me, this is also a possibility, except that it takes more space. The dried eggplant, you've seen them on strings. The dried eggplant, it's the skin and then some eggplant pulp, and they dry it in the summer and use that in cooking. But probably it was the seeds. So they'd bring it back to these southern French little towns, and they'd plant it. And then, I was talking about the public ovens. I can just see them going back and forth with their dishes to put in the ovens, and people saying, because everybody's nosy about food. I mean, things haven't changed so much. What's that you're putting in there? And then they taking it back and learning to use it themselves. So it seems to me that's early on how foods spread. So, and that's why I said that about the Thai vin, the sauce. So then what happened was, and there were Jews that were being, well, okay. So the Jews went there. Then we just have Jewish food in Provence. And then as Jews move farther north, as these merchants were moving, right? Because finding new places to live, and everybody moves. That's the way they do it. So they went to a cooler climate, and Benjamin Tudela, who wrote he had his trip in the 11th century, talked about I've got to be careful, Peggy's here. The Jews of Alsace. He talked about there were many, many Jews in Alsace at that time. And I realized that before then, these Jews moved to a place, and he called it Ashkenaz. It was a valley between France and southern Germany. And so he called these Jews Ashkenaz, but it was Alsace, and it was the land of Alsace. And nearby was Rashi, the famous rabbi and philosopher. And Rashi, who was a vintner, wrote a lot about food. So we learn a lot from all of these different things. Well, first of all, they didn't have any olive oil. There were no trucks bringing olive oil from the south. It was a different climate. So what did they use? What could the Jews use for cooking? They couldn't use lard, so they used goose fat. And so they got into the goose business. They had learned, during the Egyptian times, Jews had learned the art of force-feeding geese from the Egyptians. So they had carried it with them throughout history. And of course, it had been something prevalent in the Roman Empire. So when people came, not just Jews, came to Alsace and also to the Dordogne and to the southwest of France, they learned to use to produce goose fat. They used it for themselves. They produced the liver to sell because it fetched a lot of money, and they used the quills for pens and the feathers for pillows and for covers. So it was a good little business. I met one person whose father was in the goose liver business. I think the envelopes, the stationaries in my book, and their telephone number was number 1 in the town they lived in, and it said goose liver and foie gras, and I suspect the Jews didn't eat the foie gras, and I'll tell you a great story about that makes me think that they didn't. Israel was one of the big producers of foie gras until recently, and as long ago as the time of Rashi said the Jews will be punished for force-feeding geese. Now, actually, if you've ever seen a goose, they love being force-fed. Anyway, rabbis have railed against it for centuries, and now it's outlawed in Israel. However, there was a kosher dinner for the 4,000th year of the city of Jerusalem in Jerusalem, I don't know, about 15 years ago. And Jean-Louis Paladin, remember him, the chef from Washington who unfortunately died, he was decided that he was going to make kosher foie gras. So in order to make foie gras kosher, you have to grill it or broil it to get rid of the fat. I mean, of the blood. And there's so much blood actually in a liver that in the ancient world, people thought that the liver was the soul of man, and that you could tell somebody's future by looking at a liver. So to take the foie gras, they would grill it, blood would come out, and so, so he then would shave off that rubbery crust, and he'd use the foie gras. Well, the rabbis saw what he did, and they said, this isn't going to work. You can't use the foie gras because there's more blood in it. So they threw out 40 pounds of foie gras. So Jean-Louis said to them, well, how old are these dietary laws? And he said, 3,000 years. And he said, the rabbi said, so he said, well, isn't it time to change? Anyway, so my guess is they really couldn't use it, but they learned from them, again, adaptation, that they could take chicken livers, and this is what also was invented in Alsace and southern Germany, was they would grill the livers, and then they were so tough that they needed to massage them to make them good. So they would put a hard-boiled egg in. For some reason, a hard-boiled egg makes things lighter. And they'd put in onions, sautéed onions or fresh onions, and a lot of goose fat or chicken fat. And so chopped liver was born. And there were all these pâtés with lard and with different, pork fat that Jews sort of adapted. So those three dishes, matzo balls, kugel, and they're really quintessentially Jewish dishes, and chopped liver were invented in this area and went east as the Jews were kicked out of France. So, which I think is absolutely fascinating, because then I'll tell you some other things. The Jews could have gotten oranges from Morocco, and oranges and lemons also came from India, and then they came to Morocco and Spain. But Jews would get their vitamin C in the winter down there, not in Alsace. So what did? They did a lot of pickling. And they pickled the cucumbers. They pickled sauerkraut, cabbage, and they made that, and that's where they got their vitamin C. And also they put the sauerkraut in their Sabbath stew because there were some comments by non-Jews about those stinky stews with cabbage of the Jews for the Sabbath. And that was an Alsatian thing. And who knew? That might have been the beginning of sauerkraut. I don't know. I mean, I would never say this is Jewish, that's Jewish. The point is it's regional and it was adapted. That's all that I know. And I don't see how anybody can actually, it's too far back in history. Anyway, so then the Jews as the Inquisition gained momentum, a lot of Jews converted. Nostradamus converted, Montaigne family converted, other people did. And you have to think about it. When I was a kid, I went to Sunday school. I thought it would be terrible to convert. Why would you convert? I guess I would die rather than convert. But, to live and to convert makes a lot of sense, Really. Anyway, so, but there were 4 towns that Jews could live in, and they were in Avignon, Carpentras, Cavaillon, and Ile-sur-la-Sorgue. And they lived there. They had it was called a carrière from the 14th century to the 18th century. And it was a stone, everything was stone in those days, but it was a little enclosed area where the Jews were enclosed from 8 o'clock at night to 8 o'clock in the morning. And then they had no stores there. It was just housing. And they must have had a little bit of fireplaces. You can see the remnants of them as you go around these towns. And it's really interesting to see them. And then after 1789, most of them left totally. But think about it, 400 years, they weren't forced to live there. And they lived there because this was their home. Home is a very important part of a human being. And the synagogues, if you've ever been to Carpentras or Cavaillon, are absolutely gorgeous. And that's where they put their money, in these tiny little synagogues. Then, just get some more water. And then what was interesting is in the synagogue they had matzah, a matzah bakery, and in the matzah bakery, I've talked too much. All right, I'll quickly go. They had the Gentiles loved the matzah so much that they made enough matzah to distribute to all the bakeries, and it's in the records of the city of Carpentras and Cavaillon, which is really interesting. Anyway, so let me just quickly. Then the Jews were from Spain and Portugal. Some of them came as marchands portugais to Bayonne and Bordeaux. And these marchands portugais brought with them chocolate as a drink. And this was supposed to have cured the humors. And then it became chocolate. But Jews were the best chocolate makers at the beginning. And I'm sort of, I'm going to take off my jacket. It's hot. It's hot in here, isn't it?
Joan just came from the dentist.
I came from the dentist, and I just didn't get a lot of sleep last night. Anyway, and then, of course, the Jews from the how did that go? Anyway. Then in the 19th century, Jews came in we had 2.5 million Jews came here from Poland and Russia, and about 100,000 came to France. And then after, I'm really dizzy. Why don't we have some questions and then I'll continue.
Do you want to sit down? You want to sit down, Joan? Why don't you sit?
Why don't I sit? And all right, why don't you ask me questions?
No, you know what? We'll turn this chair around. Here.
Okay, I'm just
Sit down.
This has never happened to me before. Okay, all right. Yes. Okay, well, let me just quickly finish and just tell you, because I think it's really sort of important to understand all this. Then the Jews of Germany, then of course World War II came. And a lot of these Eastern European Jews had names like Ginsburg and Nemirovsky, and they were taken away right away. In 1942, the French police collaborated with the Gestapo, and 83,000 Jews were taken away, and 6,000 came back. But what's remarkable about France is that they came back. And in doing this book, I found how many righteous Gentiles there. You know, it's hard to be really good in this world. It's hard to be a hero. And many of these people were silent heroes. And as I was writing the book, people opened up to me. At first, they wouldn't. People would say, one woman I went to visit in a restaurant, I didn't even know she was Jewish. And I said, what I was doing, I'm writing about the Jews of France, and she said quickly, pas juif ici. No Jews here. Then I learned her name was Rosenfeld, and she was a Hebrew Jew during the war. So that kind of thing happened all the time. And, people say to me, I've been doing business in France for years. I've never met a Jew. And I thought, yeah, you really think you haven't met a Jew. You haven't met a Jew. But the point is that there are Jews all over the place in France. Anyway, and then after, let's see, so they came back. And then after the Second World War, the Jews of, there was independence of Algeria, Tunisia, and Morocco. And that was in 59, 60, 61. So 100,000 Jews came from North Africa. And they came all over France. Today there are more than almost half the Jews of France. And one of the reasons that I wrote the book was that a lot of Ashkenazi Jews said to me, find the old recipes, because in almost every marriage of an Ashkenazi, of a Sephardic Jew and an Ashkenazi Jew, the Sephardic Jew wins with food. And so, so the old recipes are going. And, you know, and I'll just tell you one or two stories about writing the book, which was so much fun. And Carol will know this. Maybe she's heard this story. Because Carol Amherst is the head of the European division. No, not European.
Just French.
Just French. She was staying at my friend's house when I was there in Paris one of the times. Anyway, my friend Connie and I were in a taxi, and I said to the taxi driver, I want to go to this restaurant called Au Rendezvous La Maison de Couscous. And he knew the restaurant right away, and he said, why do you want to go to that restaurant? I said, well, I heard it's a good Tunisian restaurant. And he said to me, well, you know, it's kosher. And I said, I know it's kosher. So I said, how do you know it's kosher? And he said, well, I'm a Tunisian Jew. And I have a list of recipes I'm going to get. And I said, oh, does your wife make couscous de poisson? Fish couscous? He said, yes. I said, can I come for Shabbos tonight? So that's one of the ways I get recipes. Anyway, great. For me, I think that the most interesting part of this book for me was having learning and understanding of the way food developed in Europe. Not just Jewish merchants, other merchants, but that how it, during the Middle Ages, and there's still so much for me to learn, but I think I learned enough to give people an aperçu of what it was like. And I thought it was really exciting. You know, I mean, the recipes are great, but what I learned was so fabulous. Anyway, any questions you have? I think, yeah.
Well, I have kind of two questions. One is about like the Jewish food in the Marais. Is that strictly Jewish food, or has it combined with French cooking? And also, what about preserved lemons? I know that they're big in
Okay. Well, again, preserved lemons are something that is North African, and which means it's Arab, it's Jewish, it's everybody. The preserved lemons that are mostly around France, which I don't really like very much, are commercialized. You preserve them in water. It's a lemon that you put salt in. I always cut them down, put salt in, and then I put them in lemon juice. I don't put them in water. And I just let them sit for a month, and they're so good. I put them in my hummus. I put them in chicken, and you cut them up as like just sort of a condiment. They're absolutely delicious, and very much part of Jewish cooking, Jewish North African cooking, and also French Jewish cooking. That's becoming, but everything is becoming not just Jewish cooking. Preserved lemons, harissa, which is a hot sauce. They're just becoming French. Every market you go to, every market has harissa today and preserved lemons. So it's becoming part of French cooking, not classic French cooking, but French cooking. And I think that outside influences have always been part of French cooking. And it's the same, really. The Marais was the traditional Jewish part of Paris, but it really was, it was outside of Paris in the Middle Ages. That's where Jews could live. And the poor immigrants would go there. But now it's become like the Lower East Side, which is like chic boutiques, and there are some Simbad. There are two, which isn't French at all. There are two hummus places, one next to, across the street from the other. And then there are a lot of good, there's some butchers, kosher butchers, and some good bakeries. There's one bakery, a man and his ex-wife have two different bakeries. One is called Finkelstein, that's yellow, and his wife's, Florence, is blue. Go to the blue one. Because the food is better. And there, what's so interesting too is you'll get Jewish Eastern European food, because that's where their tradition is, more like what it was in Eastern Europe, but a little bit Frenchified. Just as we had all these Eastern European immigrants came here, and they were, you know, like Joseph Kraft changed having farmer's cheese in his cheesecake to having Philadelphia cream cheese. Or they had like a crustless crustless cheesecake, very light, wonderful, at Finkelstein's. And what do we have here? Graham cracker crust, because Joseph Kraft bought a graham cracker crunch. So ours is, you know, Kugels in America have
Dole pineapple and cherries and whatever manufacturers could get into our recipes in every culture, they got into them. So I think that's the difference. It's a long answer. Yes, Steve.
You made a reference to 1789 and Jews leaving towns after that time. Made me wonder about the impact of the French Revolution on the Jewish community.
Oh,
Are there any
big time.
stories related?
Well, I think the most important part of the French Revolution for the Jewish community was that it was, the rights of man. They were treated as equals, so that the Jewish communities around France were organized by a consort. What's it called? Consistoire, and so that, like, my relatives in Annecy were the president of the Consistoire. Believe me, that opened a lot of doors for me in France when I was interviewing other Jews, because they said, oh, well, if her relatives are that, then she's okay. They could trust me. But it made them like every other citizen. So they no longer had to live in places where they couldn't go into town. There were, and by the way, all these rules were not totally rules, because like they said that Jews were kicked out of France from such and such a time to such and such a. I have letters that I found from Jews in these towns. So it's like places like Abu Dhabi, where they say there are no Jews. There are Jews. People live everywhere. So it wasn't as strict as they said, but it was more the rights of man than anything else. And of course, my guess is that a lot of them, in Alsace, there were 150 villages where Jews lived until 1789. So they would go to, a lot went to Paris. So that a lot of people are from Alsace, but now they're Parisian. And of course, from my point of view, they lose a lot of the old recipes when they.
One last question.
Okay. Yeah.
I think you might be interested in that story. I was born in Egypt, and we escaped in 1948, and we went to France because my grandfather had been part of the exodus from Jerusalem and French citizenship. So I lived in France for many years, and when I was there, my mother insisted that we had to go to cooking class at night. We were exhausted because we worked, we didn't want to go, but we went, and I learned a lot about French cooking. And I intermarried. I married an American Ashkenazi. And in addition to that, we learned French cooking, and we adapted it to whatever we were doing, which was very interesting. And when I came to America, the first cookbook I bought was one of yours.
Oh, really? Oh, that's so nice.
Did you write
Which one? The
about
one Jerusalem?
chain cooking?
What?
Chain cooking, like you buy chicken and you make 5, 6, 7 dishes out of it. But anyway, that was one of the first books I bought was yours, and you talked about matzah. In Egypt, our matzah was humongous, thin. We had to make a space in the dining room. I never met Manischewitz till I went to France, and that was a whole new world. And the matzah is very delicate and delicious compared to, Manischewitz. It's like a challenge.
That's really interesting. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you all, and Joan will be happy to sign your book.
This has been a presentation of the Library of Congress. Visit us at loc.gov.